onto something that I've been seeing, and it's actually really, really worrisome with me. If you watch my interview with Les Leopold, we spoke about inequality, but I noticed a trend among some of the younger people to they still reject both parties, and that's fine. But they turn to libertarianism. And I'm not sure if it's 100% true. We already know that, the media organizations, they actually do manipulate the polling, because if you look at the polling, a lot of times the polling matched the fraudulent results. So there's no way that that could happen without some sort of collusion there with the polling agency kind of manipulating the polling information. But what was interesting is that if you think about what where libertarianism comes from, the the classical liberalism, and how it comes from, you start with like Adam Smith and John Locke and all those guys. Like, there really are like the original neoliberals. Like, neoliberalism is a little bit better than what it was, back in those guys' day. So they were coming out of feudalism, and because of where they came from was bad, what they moved into with capitalism definitely looked good by comparison. But, human society has progressed in some cases and regressed in some cases since then, right? So now that has kind of matured and ran its course. I think it's important to note that the reasons why a lot of those original ideas that started out with Adam Smith and John Locke kind of like lost their luster would be because of what happened in the 1800s and the labor union battles here in the United States. Those things happened, and so you have a new generation of classical liberals that came up that kind of rejected the idea that the government shouldn't take an active role and basically providing for the general welfare and promoting the general welfare of its citizens. Like, basically, those guys' ideas began to become rejected, and they took on a new form. Now, one of those new forms actually, produces the progressive era of the United States, and then later on comes back, with a huge groundswell of popular support from the people, and they pushed and got like a lot of things that we have today. Now, and another offshoot of that would be, the current Democratic Party, and to a lesser extent the Republican Party. Like, all of those political philosophies all came from that same general birthplace, but as they went down, they all kind of split and diverged and formed new thoughts. But going back to libertarianism, that really is just like trying to go back to the original and try to apply those ideas. But they won't apply all the ideas, because even Adam Smith recognized there's a difference between money you make from working and money you make from owning property. He can actually distinguish between the two. And he felt that money you make from owning property actually should be taxed higher than money you make from working, because he felt that production from labor was super important, and production from land that you just owned without actually working it to produce anything was less important. Now, if you extrapolate that out to today, that would mean like people who work on, Wall Street and all that, they probably shouldn't make more than everybody else. They probably shouldn't make more than teachers or firemen or people that work in a machine shop or janitors or mechanics. They probably shouldn't make much more than them. And they definitely shouldn't have the tax advantages that they have in America today. But outside of a philosophical debate, because I can go on all day about that, it doesn't make any sense to me. But let's look at like at least one or two things that Gary Johnson is supposedly about that I can't get with. The one thing that pops into my mind is he wants to eliminate the income tax and just institute a flat tax. And first off, I want to state that it is impossible to do such a thing. To fund the government off of a flat tax or a consumption tax is impossible. You were saying that people who spend their money, like there are people in this country who never spend anywhere close to what they make. And that means rather than taxing them on uh, taxing them a percentage of what they spend, you should tax them on their income. But if you start taxing them on what they spend, now they're paying taxes on such a small amount of their income, and they have so much of the income distribution in this country that you would basically not get the revenue you need to run the government. That is literally what would happen if you tried to institute a consumption tax. A flat tax is not as bad as that because you would get more revenue, but again, it still falls far short of what you need to actually fund the government. You actually need a progressive tax system, especially because the income stratification is so bad. The people at the top have so much of the money that if you tax everybody the same, the savings that they would get at the top would just overpower everything else because that's where all the money is. So you just can't give away that money. I like to even look at tax cuts as almost like an expenditure. You know, if you give out a tax cut, you've now cut your revenue. So now you can spend less. It's the same thing as if you bought something. You have now cut your reserve of cash. So now you have to spend less. It's effectively the same thing. You know, in a simple sense. Of course, it's not the same when it comes to government, but just in a simpler sense, it's the same thing. And then, you know, supposedly Gary Johnson is not about, you know, intervening in the Middle East. He's not about military involvement. But when asked about ISIS, he's 100% committed, just like Donald Trump, just like Hillary Clinton, to expanding military conflict in a broad range, like just a war on terror, to fight the threat of ISIS, which is a result basically of the conditions we caused in the Middle East to begin with. Now, I can't tell you what the answer is. I can't say that a full withdrawal is the correct solution, but I can tell you that clearly a military only approach is definitely not the right approach because we've been in it for 15 years in military involvement in that region, and we haven't produced any kind of results that are worth mentioning. It's really just a sinkhole. I believe George Bush Sr. described going into the Middle East and staying there as a quagmire. We'd be just stuck there. Doing what? Who knows? I mean, at this point, the mission is super unclear. You get rid of ISIS, and then what are you supposed to do? How is that possible? I don't know. I can't answer those questions. But I will tell you one thing: a military only approach is probably not the approach we need to be taking.